This is A New Angle, conversations about how we're doing and where we're going. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by the Headwaters Foundation, First Security Bank, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today is our February edition of Incentives and Instincts, a recurring series in which I speak with economist and friend Bryce Ward about some of the broader challenges facing our society. Bryce, thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here as always.
Yeah. So listeners might have noticed our new closing question, which is, when was the last time you changed your mind? And why am I asking that? Well, the research on updating your beliefs is strong and convincing. Changing your mind leads to better decisions, improved mental health, increased learning, stronger relationships, and ultimately a better society. It's really important to be able to change your mind, and the experience of it, this is going to be perhaps the most nerdy thing I've ever said on this show. But after all, we are nerds. But changing your mind can be exhilarating. And I've had that experience here on this program several times. Anyway, Bryce, let's start with, you got to have a framework for changing your mind, don't you?
I, of course, do. When you posed this to me, I started just listing a bunch of things, but I was like, how do we even think about this? How do we talk about this?
Yeah.
And amongst economists, and I assume amongst the wider set of social scientists, you'll hear people talk a lot about their priors and updating their priors, right? And so the basic idea of this is when you pose some statement to me and say, well, do you think this is true or not? I have some belief about how true it is or whether it's true.
Okay.
And we'll call that my prior, right?
Sure.
Which is the probability that I think it's true, right? Some things I'm certain of. 100% probability. Other things I'm like, I don't know, 50-50, I have no idea. Or things I'm like, no, it's completely wrong. 90% sure it's not true, right?
Give us an example where a prior is like a common thing that people would be able to understand.
Here, I mean, this is the example that I always think of because I remember reading it when I was a graduate student, right? Is so Nobel Prize winning economist Gary Becker was giving some form of an interview. And he was asked about minimum wages, right? And anybody who's sat through a principles of economics class and understands the textbook model of the effect of minimum wages on employment. And at that point in time, and continuing to this day, there's been a lot of research that questions whether or not the standard economic model is correct or not.
Okay.
Right? But Gary Becker in his interview is like, well, my belief in the theory is so strong, right, that it will take way more evidence than what we've seen so far for me to change my mind on this.
Okay.
Right? He's literally, my prior is so strong.
Yep.
95% true or something
Locked
like
in
that.
on his prior.
Locked in, and he's like, look, I've seen these papers. Maybe they take it to 94, right?
Okay.
But, so that's what we mean by updating your priors, right? So that's the second component of this, right? Is new information comes in, and then we have to take that information and we have to, adjust our beliefs about the state of the world. Right? And that's called updating your priors.
Sure.
Right? So this gives us a framework for then we talk about changing our mind, right? Some things are easy to change your mind because your prior is weak, right? I didn't think it was that true. It was kind of 50-50 to begin with, or it was weakly held.
Okay.
Right? I didn't have a lot of support behind it, right?
Okay.
So any kind of new information that comes to update it, great, change my mind. Other priors are strongly held. Right, that's the Gary Becker example.
Sure.
Right, like I really believe this. You're not, it would take an enormous amount of evidence for me to update and change my mind on it. Right, so those are what we call strongly held priors, and they require a much higher evidentiary standard for you to change your mind. Right, so and so that's basically when we talk about changing our mind. Some things are just I didn't really believe it to begin with, or I didn't have enough information, or it was weakly held, and I got a little bit of new information, so I changed.
So you're describing, this is Bayesian thinking.
It's Bayesian thinking, yes.
And you're describing what a listener might categorize as what sounds like a very rational process, but it doesn't have to be driven by rationality, right?
Oh, no, I'm giving it a rational structure,
sure,
right? But most of the time this is all happening on a gut level,
yes,
right? But it's still, the idea of a model, right, is that it's still kind of describing what's happening.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Makes sense.
I'm not sitting there I'm not writing it out. I'm going to put a probability of 95 on this one, and I read this study, and now it's going to be 73, right? It's all kind of intuitive, but it's basically saying, this is how we think your intuition is kind of processing stuff, right? I have some notion of what is true. I see some information and I decide what to do with that information. And then I either change my behavior or change my belief, or I don't.
Right.
But it's useful to think about, like, and the reason I started with it, because I'm just making this list and I was like, well, is that really that interesting? Right. Because all that really was I didn't know enough.
Yeah.
Right. Like, yeah, I thought that. And then I got a little more information and I didn't think that anymore. Like an example of that, right, was back during the pandemic when the housing prices surged.
Okay.
Right. And there were just article after article or, news story after news story about, affordability crisis in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, yeah, I'm like, oh, well, clearly, I know the housing prices are going up. I can see that. Right. I can look at the data.
And at this point, were we into the, supply chain shocks?
Yeah. Point? This is all 21, 22,
sure.
All
so
in that
building
period.
Supplies were scarce.
Building supplies are scarce. You can see all of that. Right. But then, one of the standard, it's not the only metric of affordability, but one of the main metrics of affordability is the share of income devoted to rent.
Okay.
So then we get that data from the census. It comes with a long lag. And it hadn't changed. If anything, it had gone down. Right. So, look, yes, if you wanted to buy a house, they became less affordable in that period. But if you were a renter, what we see in terms of what people are spending as a share of income on rent, it didn't change. In fact, it went down in Missoula.
Yeah.
So, again, I thought it was true, but it was mostly because I essentially what I didn't know was just how much income was rising at the same time.
Right.
And I should have, but I wasn't paying enough attention to it, and you can see the income's rising. You think, oh, maybe the renters aren't benefiting, whatever it is. But it's like, when you see it put together, you're like, oh, no. The share of income devoted to rent, or the share of people devoting more than 30% of their income to rent, or whatever you want to define it as, it didn't really change.
And I would say, just to draw this out a little bit, like, you probably weren't all that emotionally invested, and your identity was not invested. Your identity might be invested in being correct on an issue, or you're considered an expert in the community. However, your emotional involvement in having your prior be correct in this particular case is pretty low.
Absolutely. And that's a wonderful distinction to add into this discussion, right? Is there's stuff that's kind of more easily to put into the Bayesian framework because it's entirely amenable to information, right? I'm talking about the state of the world.
Yes.
Right? All that example is literally descriptive, right? It's, so I thought that the world looked like this, but I didn't have the right amount of data on it. I got the correct data and I updated my belief. It's just a description of the world.
Your mind is easy to change based on a new fact.
But once it's become part of my identity,
much more trouble.
Because as you know from when my wife and I come teach in your class, right? My wife likes to talk about identity quakes.
Yeah.
Right? Is when some piece of information threatens your identity.
Yes.
And how you respond to that is very difficult, right? Because that's when those are in some sense, those are the most interesting cases, right? Because it's not just that I'm not amenable to new information, it's that I'm actually hostile to information that might lead me to update my prior.
Mm-hmm.
There's all sorts of interesting categories.
Yeah, and there's another category, and I'm not exactly sure how to map this onto Bayesian thinking, but in my experience, instances where a blind spot of mine is revealed are particularly illuminating. Like, oh my gosh, I did not even think that was a problem or an issue or a way somebody might be seeing the world. That type of mind-changing experience, I think, is, for me, an especially profound category.
Oh yeah, no, that's a nice one as well.
And I have one of those as an example, but let's get into some examples. Bryce, you want to start with a recent time or a time where you changed your mind where it was particularly profound?
Sure. I'll stick with the economics category.
Okay.
I'm assuming we'll get into more juicy stuff later. We'll start with lower level, more informational type stuff.
This might be an emotional investment for you.
It is, though. Look, for me, being wrong about the state of affordability
Yeah.
in Montana actually is an identity threat to me. But like, it's at least an understandable one given the lag in data collection. But like, people regularly talk about the impact of taxes on migration.
Okay.
In particular, the migration of high-income business owners, whatever.
Yeah, like you raised, it's a salient topic in many communities. But New York City, for example, right now, new mayor, socialist. If he's going to, 40% of the tax base is from 1% of the population. So there's a lot of reporting on the flight risk of that 1%.
That's right. Right. So it involves high-profile people, so people like to think about it.
Sure.
And so there's a lot of debate about the impact of it. About 15 years ago, there wasn't actually a ton of research on it.
Okay.
And I lived in Portland at that time, and Portland is one of the most unique tax environments in the country. The Portland metro area is the northern little portion of Oregon and the southern portion of Washington.
Yes.
Oregon has high income taxes and no sales tax. Washington has no income tax and a sales tax.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot of shuffling of people around the border to try and avoid taxation.
Yeah.
Right?
Turns out a lot happens on that bridge.
A lot happens. Well, the two bridges, but yeah. The easy one, of course, is the Washingtonians. I don't know how many people have driven. Literally, the first thing that you encounter when you cross a bridge into Oregon is a shopping mall. Either bridge, it's a shopping center. So that's for the Washingtonians who are going to try and avoid paying consumption taxes.
Yeah.
On the Oregon side, the more interesting question is about the income risk. Now, Oregon will tax your income even if you work in Oregon, whether or not you live in Washington. So it's harder to avoid, regular labor income taxation via the border. And so, kind of the assumption is, well, this doesn't matter, right? However, there's one category of income that you can see in advance and move to avoid, and that's capital gains. And so I did a report a long time ago that basically showed, that people who are going to realize capital gains suddenly move to Vancouver.
Vancouver, Washington. North of Portland.
Clark County. And you just see this in the data. Years with high stock market returns, there's a lot of flow, particularly from people who are getting stock options in Intel.
Interesting.
I even found a literal single individual in the tax data who I believe sold a company that was worth a lot in Bend and moved to Washington in the year they sold their company. So you see this stuff. But it seemed like it's a leak in a bucket. It's not a big deal.
Sure.
Right. It's something, but not nothing. But my prior going into that was that it didn't matter because that's what the studies that existed said. And my kind of coming out of it was that, it was a capital gains thing, but it wasn't much else. But in the past 15 years, we actually have a bunch more research, and people really do move in response to taxes. Business founders, superstar scientists, athletes, entertainers, it's a small portion of the population, but that's who you're targeting with a lot of these taxes.
Yeah, and they pay a lot of the overall tax receipts.
And it is absolutely true that most people do not respond, right? Most people are stuck in place for other reasons.
Yeah.
But there's a margin along which people do respond.
So it is an issue.
It's absolutely an issue,
and
right?
one worth paying attention to.
And one that, when I started this all, I was like, no, people just live where they live, and it doesn't matter.
It's just a talking point for
Exactly.
politicians. Okay. My first example is more experientially grounded. So I've taught strategy classes here. I teach brand strategy. And I've worked on strategy here at the College of Business and at the university. And for a long time, until recently, my belief that the core of strategy was some unique idea. We're going to do something differently and translate that thing we do differently into a grand vision and create this grand vision that then becomes, something a leader can plant a flag around and say, we're all running toward that flag. So it's kind of the big idea and the big story behind that idea.
So strategy is fundamentally about vision. Am I
Well,
paraphrasing that?
I mean, in my experience, that's kind of what I thought. Like, okay, in order to come up with a good strategy, we got to come up with a big idea that's different and can inspire. And in recent years, I've come to believe that the outcomes are more driven by execution. That what's more important than the big grand idea is the execution. I think it was John Chandler, previous guest, former colleague, who said something along the lines of, ideas are cheap, execution is expensive. And, my experience here at the University of Montana, it is the leaders who are able to actually implement strategy that are the ones that are moving the institution forward. There's a lot of interesting ideas in higher ed right now, but seeing a path from where we are to putting those into place is difficult. And the leaders who can do that, I think, are the ones who are good at strategy. They're the ones that were good at leading and getting the organization where it needs to go.
I mean, particularly in a university setting, everybody worships the idea.
Yeah.
Right. It's why you all sit through so many committees. Right?
Exactly.
Everybody wants to come up with like the new big vision.
Yeah.
I mean, even my short time here, I feel like I went through 2 giant visioning processes.
Yeah.
Right?
I've been at the center of them, and I fancied myself as one of those visioning types, but it's really...
But yeah, at the end of the day, like, execution is, if you can't execute your vision, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
I mean, we could summarize it with Mike Tyson's famous quote, like, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of part of it, because trying to implement strategy, trying to implement any new idea is an act of getting punched in the face.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I'm not well versed in your strategy classes. Maybe I should come take them. But yeah, no, I would certainly. Strategy is being able to execute is often the main differentiator, right? Yeah. Like we love to talk about the genius of someone's idea, but like economists love to talk about survival bias, right? Mm-hmm. Which is like, we like, let's take our success advice from the people who succeeded.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But you're conditioning on the outcome, right? What you need to see is all the people who had the same idea that didn't succeed.
Yeah.
And then go, well, what was different about, once we've shown you all of the people who had the exact same idea as you in roughly the same time period. And we know that that's common, right? And the classic example of that is the fact that, 2 people submitted a patent for the telephone on the same day, right? Like, so working completely independently, you're coming up with the same stuff. We know that kind of thing happens in the world. Is lots of people are out there thinking about the same thing at the same time. But yeah, it's who can actually make their idea a reality. So, but yeah, but you go read biographies and it's all about how my great idea and how wonderful my idea is. And
that's a better story.
Every once in a while you'll get somebody who is like, yeah, I'm really good at execution, and that's what made me different. Those are fun to read. But yeah, I wish it was all about ideas because I like ideas, but execution is really a lot of where things are at.
I think it's where a real difference in organizations is made. Okay, Bryce, you're next.
I thought that the world, in terms of a big, if you said it to me when I was younger, I would have said I was almost certain that people, and particularly Americans, had a reasonably good process for agreeing on what reality is and for what our core values were.
Yeah.
I no longer believe that.
Yeah.
I would assign that a less than 50-50 probability.
I think one of mine is in this category, and it actually it's an idea that I heard from an economist, Russ Roberts, host of the Econ Talk podcast. I don't know if he's still at George Mason, but kind of, I don't know. Anyway, I was listening to an interview with Russ Roberts, and he said, I used to believe that the marketplace of ideas was efficient, that the best ideas, you'd smash a bunch of ideas around, subject them to critique and argument, and the best ones would rise to the top. And the way he said it stuck with me. He says, I no longer believe that. I now believe that the ideas that make people feel the best are the ones that will win. And that seems consistent with what has driven our media environment, what's driven our polarization, what's driven our discourse in many ways. It's less about the quality of the idea and more about the
the identity about the idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, it's I think that's where that we bridge the two worlds, right? Is look, I was never naive enough to think that people didn't have ideologically motivated perspectives on the world.
Yeah.
Right? But my belief was that the marketplace of ideas kind of forced you towards or away from really bad, terrible ideas, right? Look, you're never going to get all the way to perfect usually in a big group because, and rightfully so, frequently.
Yeah.
But, you know, you kind of would be like, that's bad. We shouldn't do that. Let's fix this. We'll go forward, you know. And, you know, you had a process that would allow you to pursue ideas and make mistakes and correct them and make mistakes and correct them, you know, without making bigger mistakes.
Right.
And we've just been in a cycle for a long period where it's like there are relatively few institutions that have not made wild, crazy errors. And many of them are unwilling to update their beliefs and correct them.
Yeah, and I think we've mentioned in this exchange marketplace of ideas. I mean, what that is what you were talking about when you led off with this example. A marketplace of ideas is a system that everybody agrees upon to figure out what's best, what our best approximation of the truth is. And we no longer have a system that we all agree on to get to that best approximation of the truth. And that's really at the heart of this, what is often characterized as the decline of institutions. We've lost a framework, a shared framework for understanding the world we live in.
David Brooks had a great quote recently, so I pulled it up here. The most grievous cultural wound has been a loss of the shared moral order. We told multiple generations to come up with their own individual values. This privatization of morality burdened people with a task they could not possibly do, leaving them morally inarticulate and uninformed. It created a naked public square where there was no broad agreement about what was true, beautiful, and good. Without shared standards of right and wrong, it's impossible to settle disputes. It's impossible to maintain social cohesion and trust. Every healthy society rests on some shared conception of the sacred. Sacred heroes, sacred texts, sacred ideals. And when that goes away, anxiety, atomization, and a slow descent towards barbarism are the natural results. And I was like, I've been grappling with that idea for a long time, but of course I don't bother to write it down, so I had never gotten that language. But that language was like, you know, it's like the tuning fork that resonates with your brain.
Yeah.
I was like, this is what I've been talking about, and a lot in here, when I've talked about culture,
right,
and the fragility and the role of trust. All of these things are basically kind of stemming from that idea, right? And it was part of what they made me put this onto the list. Look, there were intense political disagreement at all points in time in this country.
Yeah.
And people name calling and saying that other people are bad actors and all that kind of stuff. But I really do think we're in a different period with respect to exactly what he's talking about there, right? I think there were things that we could all agree upon where like, no, that's a line we don't cross, right? You know, it doesn't matter what my identity is, whatever it is, you know, that's a line we don't cross that, or that's how we decide if something is true or not.
Yeah, I mean, there's two distinct things there. There's this sort of rules of the game, just kind of decorum, and we've seen decay of decorum, and you know, I think on balance it's a bad thing, but you know, some degree of humanity introduced into the system is fine. But then this notion of how we find truth, which is two different things, but the decay of both, I think, rolls up into that Brooks sentiment.
Right. It rolls up. You know, I mean, it's hard to find truth when you don't have manners.
And I must say, David Brooks is somebody I've changed my mind about. I've found him to be. I've been much more interested in what he's had to say the last 10 or so years. Yeah. He's really been writing some beautifully rich content. Okay, next one for me. This isn't a category I mentioned before, one of my blind spots. I was in an interview here 4 or 5 years ago with Jennifer Palmieri, She was a communications, I think, director of communications, maybe under the second Clinton administration, and worked in communications for Obama. She had a Montana connection and came here to visit and speak to our students. And she was talking about the sort of constant fear, these are her words, constant fear for physical safety that women feel. And, to even say that out loud, it sounds obvious to me now, but I had never thought of it as just this persistent tax on your existence. Because I've never thought that was, sure, there's been times where I've been somewhat concerned for my physical safety, but it's not persistent. It's a unique experience for me.
Yes, it's an outlier experience. It is not my day-to-day experience.
Yeah, and to hear somebody say, like, this is the default setting for half of the population, it just revealed a big blind spot. I was like, wow, this is to use language that you would appreciate, this is a tax on your existence that I just hadn't considered as a thing before. And then once I heard it, I was like, oh man, that's a blind spot. I need to update my priors on this in this case.
Yeah, no. I don't know if it's true that all women feel that all of the time.
Sure.
It's
probably not true that all feel it all the time.
But it's certainly like, it is certainly true that it's not something that I spend much time thinking about it.
Yes.
I was certainly more aware of it though when I was in college, right? Because the women around you were basically, it was kind of, there was a norm, right? Like, oh, you would walk people home from the library if it was late. Like, there were just kind of things that were just part of the culture at that time. I do not know if they still exist now, but they were part of the culture. Again, it was before cell phones, right? Like, we now exist in a different technological space, right? That was back in a time when it was a big deal to put the little call boxes all over campus, right?
The blue boxes they were at Penn. Yeah, but I think, like, even at that time for me, it was situational. I thought that, there are certain situations where this is asymmetric.
Yeah, it's night.
But I didn't think of it as like a difference in state.
Yeah.
I didn't think of it as a trait level difference where, like, this is persistent across most cases.
Well, and ultimately, it's because of it is a tax.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It is a tax that then it's not just that it exists. It's what are then the ripple effects and follow-on effects of that tax.
Yeah.
But to be honest, look, setting aside the gender issue, it's why you can't have public disorder. Right? Because if you have disordered public spaces, that tax now applies to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's why you need to enforce low-level standards of behavior on the streets and in the parks and in public spaces.
It's why obeying the yellow line on the road is a really important norm, essentially, that we sort of all just agree on. Driving is deadly and it could be complete chaos, but we all figure out a way to do our best to agree to the rules.
That's right. So anytime you have disorder or fear or a lack of a norm, going back to the cultural standpoint, you're paying a tax, and that tax starts to add up. And then kind of linking our discussion in the Brooks quote to this one. This is the problem, right? As a society, we cannot function at a high level if we can't agree on how we're supposed to change our mind.
Yeah.
What things are appropriate for identity level beliefs that you don't have to update on, and what are, right? That's part of the problem, right? Is that individualized thing is, well, I get to believe whatever I want, and I get to believe it as strong as I want, and you can throw whatever evidence you want at me, and I'm either going to straight outright ignore it, or I'm going to attack you because you're attacking me with the evidence that my belief is wrong.
Sure.
Right? And that then degrades the manners. And we are all in this together. This society is a cooperative enterprise, and you have to have a process for surfacing information, getting people to incorporate that information into their beliefs and move forward. Because if we can't, right? If I'm sitting there saying, well, look at all this information, and you're like, no, I don't care. We can't cooperate, right? Everything breaks down, right? I can't go out on the public street in the case of the public safety, but we also just can't agree on how to make the world operate.
That's right.
In which case, now I'm paying not just my actual financial taxes, but I'm paying all sorts of additional effort taxes that ultimately make us all poor.
Okay. I think we've established that changing your mind is useful. It's beneficial. I think we might have time for one more. Do you have another quick one?
No, not, I mean, you know, like the thing I was going to talk about that I forgot to at the beginning is, you know, this is one of the interesting things about people, right? Is, you know, I think that one of the things that I'm sure the listeners have a prior that I'm a weirdo. And one of the things that makes me a weirdo is I don't have a lot of strong priors.
Yeah.
Right. I exist in a world of I'm a high openness person.
Yeah. High cognitive flexibility.
Right. Like I'm always willing to take your idea out for a test drive.
Yeah.
Right. Like, you know, it's not, there's very little that is like, I'm just going to push that away no matter what. It's like, oh, well, let's try that out.
Sure.
Well, let's see. Well, let's think through that. Right. And then the other thing that makes me a weirdo is that then I'll just keep pursuing the information to try and figure it out. But yeah, I mean, it's one of the interesting things about people is how it's part of a little bit of personality, like the openness dimension of personality tests is sort of about this.
Yes.
But yeah, it's one of the things that I wish we had a better language for, right? In terms of, and we kind of use like words like rigid, but those have, you know, this is not, I'm not saying I'm better.
Right.
Right.
You just have this attribute. However, I do think though that Bryce, that this translates into one, your ability to figure out the best approximation of the truth, but also you are broadly perceived as a good faith actor in so many different domains. You know, you're asked to do research reports that are trusted by Republicans, by Democrats, by people in rural communities, urban communities. Across divides, you're respected as somebody open to figuring out the best approximation of the truth.
Yeah, and that's you know, I mean, that's part of my job.
Yeah.
Right. Is to, you know, but it's also what makes me well suited for my job. Right. I really don't. Like I said, I started that tax report in 2010 thinking I wasn't going to find anything.
Yeah.
Found something.
Right.
And I was like, okay, update the beliefs. Let's move
Right.
forward. Right. And, you know, but yeah, it can be difficult, right? Because lots of times, you know, people in your community or in your tribe, perceived tribe or whatever it is, will get mad at you for saying something that they perceive as undermining their goals. But, you know, again, this is why it's important. Like, not everybody, I'm not saying everybody has to be this way, but it's important that you find the people who are this way and you make sure that you put them in positions where they do their thing.
Yeah.
Right. And then hopefully then there's some other person who can translate what we say into the rest of the other people in ways that don't trigger the identity quakes that then lead us to it basically just being like, oh, here's an overwhelming amount of new information that we're just going to ignore, that, you know, and just keep doing things that make us all poorer.
Hopefully, listeners, we made some progress toward changing your mind, about changing your mind, or at least, you know, whatever openness you had to it, now you can see that it is a virtue, I think, to change your mind.
Well, look, hopefully we gave you a framework for thinking about it,
Yeah.
right? And helps you understand, okay, well, is this something that I really need to believe? And then to the extent that you have really strong priors, make sure that you evaluate those every once in a while, right? And in particular, make sure that if you're confronted with information about them, you don't get an identity quake, right? That you can basically say, like Gary Becker, like we started this, right? Like, I disagree. I think the studies that find that the minimum wage don't have as much of an effect as we thought are pretty compelling. They're not overwhelming, but they are compelling, right? And you should be updating your priors by some more amount than he did, right? So, you know, you got to have some ability to basically like, no, what's going on here? What's preventing me from absorbing the information, processing it in a way that allows me to stay true to whatever core beliefs I have?
Yeah.
And that, you know, that's the real thing that hopefully people will.
And I think that's a great sort of actionable rule of thumb. Like the more tightly held beliefs that you have, you should seek, or not necessarily seek, actually I think seek information counter to those beliefs, or at least be uniquely open to interrogating any new information that that has the potential to pierce a tightly held belief.
Particularly from a good faith actor.
Yes, exactly. Okay, Bryce, as always, thank you. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsor is the Headwaters Foundation, working side by side with Western Montanans to improve the health of our communities. We are also supported by First Security Bank and the University of Montana College of Business, with additional help from CED, Drum Coffee, and Montana Public Radio. Keely Larson is our producer. Libby Riddle is our production assistant. And finally, John Brownell, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.